When you're creating programs for athletes, these are all based off of scientific evidence. Even the programs that you see in bodybuilding magazines or any type of magazines that have some sort of repetition scheme and weights and intensity of that nature, that's all kind of based off of scientific evidence and research. So this is why research is very important within our field. Not only with that is that it provides new strategies or techniques. So just to give you an example of kind of the new strategy or techniques of how research is important is, say back in the day when individuals first started lifting, they probably just did 3 sets of 8, right? And they continue that to see improvements, and then they kind of plateaued and so forth. But with research and everything, they developed new strategies such as periodization or different repetition schemes, volume, changing the volume, sets, intensity, and so forth, and saw that you can break that plateau and increase performance as well. The importance of that is that we want to develop programs to increase the athlete's athletic performance. So whether this be strength, anaerobic power, speed, agility, aerobic capacity, and endurance, and body composition, those all kind of encompass athletic performance. Not only is research important just because it develops new strategies or techniques, it's also able to reevaluate old literature. So again, tying back into an old example, they used to do just 3 sets of 10 and that was it. Then, a little bit later on, they started, periodizing. So beginning, lightweight, high repetitions, they start moving it towards a little bit heavier. And then by the end of the training program, high intensity, very low repetitions. With that developed, daily undulating periodization, which you're always changing the volume and intensity for the athlete. So you're always kind of seeing some sort of, adaptations. Also, by reevaluating the old literature, that allows you to say, hey, maybe, this isn't really correct and we need to improve something, or based off of this, we might maybe find a new strategy or technique to help increase the athlete's performance. But how we do that is we need to test these athletes and perform certain measurements that kind of, make the core of the evaluation process. But as strength and conditioning coaches, you must appropriately interpret the results from these assessments. And these assessments can, have a wide range that you can test, but mostly you'll be testing them through laboratory settings or field settings, and then using this to evaluate them. And with this evaluation, you are pretty much going to be able to inform the sports coach and the athlete on what they did well and what they need to improve on. Right? And this is all going to be dependent on, sport specific. So if you're in a sport where strength really matters, and then that's a little bit low, right, you're going to create a program for that athlete to improve strength. Right? And by testing these athletes, you're going to be able to develop an athletic profile. Right? And so for this, when we think of athletic profile, we can somewhat, use this and utilize this as some sort of way to see if this individual is going to be successful in the sport. So you kind of use that baseline if they're hitting certain criteria marks or anything like that, and that translate to winning or being successful on the field, then, whenever you have other athletes come in, you can kind of use that standard. The reason why we need to test athletes is because it's important for the coach to determine whether an individual has the physical potential to play a sport at the competitive level for the team. So really, this is a way for the coach to determine whether the candidate has the necessary basic physical abilities, along with technique and practice to be successful or at least be competitive. So by doing this, we can determine which physical qualities that individual has and what they need to work on. And based off of that, we can prescribe that some sort of goal for their exercise programs. So we know that some physical capabilities are innate and they can't be changed, while others can be performed. Right? And some of this can deal with just kind of genetics and based off your parents and how well you respond. But other reasons for why we are testing is because it can set goals. Like I just mentioned, we can set individual goals based off their needs. So if they're, have a low strength profile, we can, develop a training program that's mainly focused on strength. While, another individual, another teammate, their strength is fine, but say that their power is a little bit low or their speed is a little bit low and you want them to improve, we can do that. And based off these small individual goals, right, this will collectively be a team-based set kind of goal, right, and how we can kind of set your criteria for that, or what the standard is basically winning, right? So if you're winning, you know that, you know, your training program is being successful, the athletes are having that transfer from the strength training room, you know, to the field, right? And by so they're winning. We can also kind of evaluate the process. We can provide different measurement time points, provide some sort of baseline for this athlete. And this is where we kind of set up that athletic profile, because by setting up that athletic profile, it kind of gives you your starting point, and you can kind of see how the athlete progresses, and can always refer that back, right? If an athlete gets injured, you can see what their numbers were before, right? And try to set that goal to attain those numbers again following an injury, and so forth. But your different measurement time points will also be important, right? Because, you know, you can just test an athlete just 2 times before and after a training program, or you can test them multiple times. So with that, that's all kind of dependent on how you want to test them, and so forth. But usually testing them pre and post program is at least the standard, right? Additional ones can be beneficial. Some key terms to know is a test, which is a procedure for assessing ability in a particular endeavor. We could perform multiple tests when we are, you know, evaluating athletes, such as their strength, their endurance, their vertical jump, and their aerobic capacity. So we can see that with this test, they're kind of split up in 2 portions. One is a laboratory setting, which is a little bit more expensive and takes up a lot more time, but a field test is probably something that you might be doing often if you have a big group of athletes. So a field test is a test used to assess the ability that is performed away from the laboratory and does not require extensive training or expensive equipment. Another key term to know is measurement, which is the process of collecting test data. So once we perform a particular test, we measure that and get some sort of value, and that value can be seconds, it can be inches or centimeters. It all depends on what we're doing for that. We can also utilize how much weight. Multiple measurements can be performed in tests as well. So when we're thinking about measurements, you're not just going to be performing, you know, usually 1 trial. You're usually going to maybe perform, you know, at least 3 trials, and then kind of get an average for that, so the athlete can kind of give, you know, a rough idea. And also, you know, their first trial might not be as great compared to the second one or the third one. Another key term to know is evaluation, which is the process of analyzing test results for the purpose of making decisions. This is a big component that we've talked about already during the needs analysis, such as, you know, what exercises do you need to incorporate into the training program to kind of, you know, help prevent, you know, future injuries, or kind of get them back from following an injury. Also, we kind of use this evaluation on setting up certain goals for the athlete as well. Again, do they need to focus on their strength or their power and so forth, or muscular endurance? We can also use this evaluation even for body composition, such as their weight. You'll see some individuals come into, you know, the season underweight. You know, usually this is, you know, freshmen individuals majority of the time, where they're pretty small just because they're coming out of high school. They don't, you know, they have other things to do, but now they can really focus since it's, you know, college, and that's kind of their main priority. So you can see that, you know, by their nutrition habits and everything, they can gain, you know, X amount of weight until next year. You also see that, you know, later in some athletes' career, if they want to still improve their body composition as well. Another key term is mid-test, which is a test administered 1 or more times during the training period to assess progress and then modify the program as needed to maximize the benefits. So we just kind of talked about this a little bit earlier on how it's important to kind of have pre and post-test measurements for evaluating athletes' profiles. But this mid-test kind of gives you, you know, a good benefit by adjusting it. So if you see that, you know, they're not making the necessary progress of increasing their strength, right, you can maybe add a little bit more strength days into the program, right, and maybe decrease their hypertrophy days, so they actually reach their goal by the end of the program. Another terminology is formative evaluation, which is periodic reevaluation based on mid-tests administered during the training, which is usually at regular intervals. So kind of tying back into what we just mentioned with the other key term, mid-test, we can utilize the results and the measurements and kind of reevaluate the whole training program. So again, we can decrease the individual's hypertrophy days and slowly transition into more strength days, right, to reach their goal of increasing strength. Or we may have to, totally reevaluate the whole program if they had an injury, where we're going to have, exercises incorporating rehab capabilities so they can get back to the baseline a little bit quicker and then also to the field quicker. With post-test, this is a test administered after the training period to determine the success of the training program in achieving the training objectives. So the post-test is how well was the actual program that you created? Did they actually reach their goals of, say, increasing their bench press by 10 kilos in itself? And we can utilize this and, when based off this number on when we create your next training program for that athlete. So if they didn't reach their goal of 10 kilos, right? This is where your next training block or whatever, you can, focus a little bit more on strength so they actually reach that goal. There are some factors that affect performance testing. So when we are evaluating an athlete, this needs to be interpreted in relation to a number of factors. So when we compare athletes to one another, or when we compare the kind of results of a single athlete, we should understand or kind of have an idea that the test results are influenced or can be influenced by several factors. This includes body size, muscle fiber type, their training status, the specificity of the test that you're giving the athlete, the relevance of the test, and validity and reliability of the test. Generally speaking, when we look at body size, strength is positively related to it. So meaning that larger athletes are going to be a lot stronger compared to smaller athletes. And by doing so, when we look at certain sports, we can use the absolute weight strength and compare those athletes. But if we have, sports where we have weight classes such as wrestling or boxing of that some sort, we can look at relative strength. And this is, factoring in body mass. We can also utilize relative strength in sports that don't have weight classes like football. There's no weight class in that, but you can kind of calculate, the relative strength of each individual. And this is where you see some coaches or some people say within the media that this athlete is, pound for pound the strongest out of the whole group. So they're just basically factoring the body mass and, the amount of weight that they can push in the weight room. But body size can affect some other performance measurements. One of them could be mainly looking at vertical jump and power. To give you an example of how body size affects performance testing is looking at the vertical jump that I just mentioned. So we can see here that athlete 1 weighs 90 kilos or 198 pounds with a vertical jump height of 68.6 centimeters or 27 inches. Or athlete number 2, who weighs a little bit more at 110 kilos at 242 pounds with the same vertical jump height. So based off this, just looking at jump height in itself, you can see that they're very similar. But when we kind of look at the factor of how much power they are producing, that comes into question, and this is where body size affects the performance. So out of these, which do you think is more powerful out of the two? So for our example, you can see with jump height alone, you may assume that both athletes have a similar lower body power, and this is based off of the 27-inch vertical jump that both athletes attain. But when you make it relative to the athlete's body mass, the heavier individual is a lot stronger and has a lot more power. So the reason why the heavier athlete, develops a lot more power is because power is force times velocity. So with this, you can see that weight is equal to the force, which is going to generate that greater power in itself. So based off of just looking at 27 inches, and then when we kind of actually factor the power itself, you can see that the analysis and interpretation of the data can result in different outcomes. So you may say they both have similar power if you're just looking at 27 inches with that vertical jump alone, but when you factor in with the formula and making it relative, you would notice that the heavier athlete produces a lot more power. So this, way we kind of, interpret our data and how we present it can be giving us different outcomes and different interpretations. One example is a percent change from pre to post testing. So let's look at an example of how a percent change can give you two different outcomes or two different interpretations. Athlete 1 has a bench press of 100 kilos. Right? Following a training program, they increase their bench press to 110 kilos. Athlete number 2 starts out with the initial bench press of 200 kilos, and following the training program, they increase their bench press to 210 kilos. You can see that the absolute change, right, is that they both increase their bench press by 10 kilos. But when you factor in and look at the percent change from pre to post, you can see athlete number 1 has a percent change of 10%, and athlete 2 has a percent change of 5%. Based off our example, interpretation matters. So athlete 1 would seem to have the biggest strength increase in bench, while athlete number 2 didn't, and this is utilizing the percent change. Again, athlete 1 saw a 10% increase in their bench strength compared to athlete 2, who saw a 5% change in their bench strength. But we want to look at the absolute values, because by looking at that, they both increased the same amount. All right, so they both increased strength following the training program. The reason why on how we interpret and our data is that it can be misleading. So we can see that the 10% would say that that's a lot greater compared to athlete number 2. And often we see these percent changes primarily in kind of supplement ads. If you guys remember, Muscle Tech, probably years ago, they would always give you a graph in those magazines where if you took their creatine, you would see a 150% increase in strength gains compared to some other competitor, right? But if you somehow got a hold of that actual research study in itself and looked at the absolute values, you may only see that their creatine only increased strength or provided some sort of positive impact only by a few kilos, but due to the percent change, they had that such a drastic number, and why they're marketing it on saying, get this because this is the the better one and the best way to improve. So whenever you're reading research articles, particularly whenever you're looking at resistance training or anything of that, kind of looking at pre to post values and seeing the effectiveness of a program, we always want to look at the raw values. The raw values are the values that you see from pre, so the 100 kilos or the 200 kilos, and then the post values. Right? It's always good to incorporate the percent change as well, but to give you a better interpretation or to kind of formulate a better opinion on something or some sort of training program, looking at the raw values is a lot better. Looking at the next factor that can affect performance testing is fiber type composition. The contractile properties of muscles play a significant role in their ability to generate power, sustain performance, and delay fatigue. So individuals who have a high percentage of type 2 fibers can produce greater force and faster contraction velocity, while individuals with a higher percentage of type 1 fibers produce a slower rate of fatigue. Right? Also, they do not perform well within strength and power assessments. You can see this figure to the right where type 2X produces the greatest velocity, followed by type 2A muscle fiber, and then type 1. And we generally see this in sports in general. Individuals who are cross-country runners or marathon runners, you can assume that they mainly have a high percentage of type 1 fibers, where individuals who are sprinters or jumpers will mainly contain a high percentage of type 2 muscle fibers. When looking into the 3 different types of muscle fibers, they all produce different characteristics. Slow oxidative fibers are considered type 1, which combine low myosin ATPase activity with high oxidative capacity. Part of type 1 is that they have a slower contraction speed. They also have a high mitochondria and myoglobin content, and its appearance of type 1 muscle fibers is red. Fast oxidative glycolytic fibers are considered type 2A, which combine high myosin ATPase activity with high oxidative capacity and intermediate glycolytic capacity. These muscle fibers are intermediate and are considered fast twitch muscle fibers. Fast glycolytic fibers are considered type 2X, which combine high myosin ATPase activity with high glycolytic capacity. With type 2X, they produce faster contraction speed, but they have fewer mitochondria and myoglobin content compared to type 1. Another characteristic of type 2X is that they contain a large storage of glycogen, which is utilized for exercise, and its appearance with these type 2X muscle fibers is white. You may have seen this figure in exercise physiology, but this is a figure that gives the fiber type distribution between athletes. You can see cross-country skiers have a high fiber type distribution of type 1 fibers, but sprinters have the least fiber type 1 distribution that you can see here on the bottom. Athletes have very little ability to significantly alter their fiber type composition through training. So when evaluating athletes during their speed and agility tests, it needs to be recognized that athletes have some sort of physiological limitation that will influence the extent of their improvement. This is where selecting your parents come into play. So if you want to be pretty fast, then you have to have parents who have a high composition or distribution of type 2A and type 2X muscle fibers, where if you want to be successful in distance running and marathon running, your parents should have a high distribution of type 1 muscle fibers. The training status of an athlete can affect performance testing. This is because training experience can determine the extent of the magnitude of potential performance improvements. So we've always kind of experienced this when we first started lifting, that due to this, we saw these great improvements in increases in strength, increase in muscle size, but as we continued to lift and got more experience, right, those improvements slowly started to decrease, right? So, we had a smaller potential for increasing these performance gains. So once we get to a high enough level, we may see this plateau, and then changes in performance are difficult to achieve. So this is where, this plateau may be, individuals may kind of consider this the genetic ceiling, right? Just due to your physiological makeup in itself. And some, strategies or ways to, possibly, break this plateau is through periodization. Periodization is a form of resistance training strategy that, you coaches and, what you'll kind of program athletes for to always continue on increasing their performance. We'll kind of talk about periodization and how to kind of set that up and, the different ones out there later on throughout this semester. Regardless of training status, athletes with a high ability may also be limited in significant improvements in a certain area. So as strength and conditioning professionals, you should understand where the athlete kind of sits on this curve, which is demonstrated in the figure to the right. You can see at the bottom, this is where you first start lifting or start training and start seeing significant improvements. But as you become more experienced and trained, you start having this plateau or reaching your ceiling of effect. So when you're setting goals for your athletes, depending on where they sit, make them realistic training goals and have certain expectations. So when you see individuals who are just starting out, you expect them to have big increases in improvements, where individuals who've been training for years, just the slightest increase or increase in performance is going to have a huge benefit for them. Okay, so it's important for interpreting performance results in that nature. Other things to consider in these improvements is looking at the significance. Generally speaking, we want to see if there's any statistical significance, but whenever you're a high-level athlete, you may take practical significance over that. Meaning, individual who is running a 100-meter yard dash just sees an improvement of 0.02 seconds. Statistically, that may not mean anything, but practically, that may be the deciding factor for that individual to win gold or get silver. So you're going to have to try to find the balance with that for these athletes and how to interpret that. When selecting an appropriate testing battery, it is generally based on the relevance of each particular fitness component within the particular sport. With that being said, if your sport really relies on strength, then selecting the tests or a strength test is going to be more appropriate than selecting a cardiorespiratory endurance test. Another thing to consider is the metabolic energy system. With this, a valid test must emulate the energy requirements of the sport for which the ability is being assessed. So we need to consider the energy demands of that sport when choosing or designing some sort of test. So the more closely you can, have your tests mimic that metabolic system, the better your results are going to be, and you can interpret it a little bit better. Same thing goes with the biomechanical movement pattern, right? So the more similar the test is to the movement in that sport, the better. So an example would be the one gate test versus the vertical jump test. So individuals who are playing basketball, looking at their power, you're going to get more benefit from the vertical jump test compared to the one gate test, which is performed on a cycloergometer. Another example of biomechanical movement pattern specificity is through strength tests. So strength training exercises and strength tests should be similar for assessment. So with this being said, we'll give an example for squats. So when you're creating a program, you want to include squats in the strength training program and then test that at the end. But if you have creating a program that is just doing leg press and then test squats, the improvement that you're going to see in the squats from pre to post isn't going to be as large compared to individuals performing squats throughout the training program. And with this can be due to multiple things. It could be due to the complexity of the actual lift, right? Machines versus free weights. With leg press, you're usually just sitting in a chair, maybe at an angle, and just pressing your feet against a resistance. So it doesn't take a lot of skill to do that, or coordination, or engaging your core. Where squats, you have to keep your balance, engage your core a lot more, and it's a lot more technical skill. Both age and sex can affect the validity and reliability of a test. So for example, the Cooper 1.5 mile run may be a valid and reliable field test of aerobic power for college-aged men and women, but may not be appropriate for pre-adolescents just because they probably lack the experience and they aren't interested in running that long. Another way we can kind of look at this is a test of the maximum number of chin-ups that can be performed. May be a valid test of elbow flexion for muscular endurance in male wrestlers, but may not be a valid test for females due to differences in upper body pulling strength. So with that, the test may not be capable of differentiating muscular endurance levels in females. So using a modified prone pull-up with the feet supported may be a more valid test. Another thing to look at is the actual environmental factors. With this, high temperatures and high humidity can impair performance, it can pose health risks, and actually lower the validity of aerobic endurance tests. So with this, when we're testing aerobic endurance, you generally want to kind of have it the same time of day, and if possible, have it indoors. Right? Just because with temperature fluctuations, this can reduce the ability to compare tests over time. If you're training at altitude, this can impair aerobic endurance tests, but if you're testing strength and power, that's not really going to have too much of an effect. With testing, the test results are only useful if the test actually measures what it's supposed to measure, and this is referred to as validity. Validity is the degree to which a test or test item measures what it's supposed to measure, which is one of the most important characteristics of testing. There are some tests that are easily established, such as height and weight, but some tests on validity on athletic abilities or capacities are a little bit more difficult. There are numerous types of validity, but the most important one is construct validity. Another important component to have in test quality is reliability. The reliability is the ability of each test to produce consistent and repeatable results. Measurement error can arise from different areas, one being intra-subject variability, which is a lack of consistent performance by the person being tested. Another one is inter-rater reliability, which is the degree to which different raters agree in their test results over time or on repeated occasions. So it is a measure of basically consistency. So what you'll need for this, or to kind of give you an example, is that a test that's simple, such as the 40-meter dash with a stopwatch, can exhibit both random and systematic error if the timer is not trained and experienced. The sprint times obtained using the handheld stopwatch are typically shorter than those obtained using the automatic timers, just because raters using the stopwatch exhibit the reaction time delay when pressing the start button in response to the gun, but do not delay in pressing the button at the finish because they can see the athlete approaching. So this inter-rater reliability is particularly important if different scores administer different tests to different subgroups of athletes. Another measurement error that can arise is intra-rater variability, and this is the lack of consistent scores by a given tester. So this differs from inter-rater reliability, which refers to the degree of agreement between different testers. So for example, a coach is eager to see improvement may, unconditionally or unintentionally be a little bit more lenient on a post-test than on a pre-test. So other causes of intra-rater variability include inadequate training, inattentive, not paying attention, the lack of concentration, or just failure to follow standard procedures. To attain accurate assessments, tests need to be administered safely and in an organized fashion. Assessment timing should be carefully planned, and all the tests should be administered in a proper sequence. Additionally, all athletes being tested should have a clear understanding of the purpose of each test. In some cases, you may have to have athletes come in prior to the actual testing, and this period is called familiarization. But when we look at the health and safety considerations, we should be aware of testing conditions that can threaten the health of the athletes, such as performing some sort of maximal aerobic tests in the high heat and humidity. We should also be very observant of signs and symptoms of health problems that warrant exclusion from testing. Another thing that we need to consider is be observant of the health status of athletes before, during, and after maximal exertions. So with this being said, it's always important to have athletes be medically cleared before actually participating. When it comes to aerobic endurance testing in the heat, we can follow guidelines to minimize health risks and obtain accurate results when testing athletes in hot environments. One is that during the weeks before the test, athletes should engage in enough training to establish a baseline of fitness in the activity being tested. Another guideline is to avoid testing under extreme combinations of heat and humidity. Another guideline we can follow is that on days when the temperature is high, indoor facilities should be used, or testing should be conducted during the morning or early evening hours. Other guidelines to follow is that the athlete should be acclimatized to the heat and humidity for at least 1 week before testing. Also, athletes should make sure they are well hydrated in the 24-hour period preceding aerobic endurance testing if in the heat. Also, athletes should be encouraged to drink during exercise in the heat and should also wear light-colored, loose-fitting tank tops and shorts, preferably of mesh material. It is important to look for symptoms of heat stroke or heat exhaustion, such as cramps, nausea, dizziness, difficulty in walking or standing, faintness, garbled speech, lack of sweat, red or ashen skin, and goosebumps. This becomes particularly important during the football season and in general, or a little bit more specific, during training camp, because it's usually performed in August during the really hot months. If you guys remember, a few years ago, there's a case where one of the strength and conditioning coaches, or one of the coaches from Maryland, one of their players passed away because of heat stroke and heat exhaustion. So it's always important to be cognizant of your athletes to look for any of these signs and symptoms of heat stroke or heat exhaustion to avoid that scenario. Not only is it important to look for symptoms of heat stroke or heat exhaustion, it is also important to be aware of the symptoms of hyponatremia or water intoxication. This is where an individual is consuming an excess of water intake. Some of the symptoms include extremely dilute urine, bloated skin, altered consciousness, a loss of consciousness, or no increase in body temperature. Other things to be aware when you are testing athletes in the heat is that proficient medical coverage should be readily available. So if an athlete encounters a test-related health problem, it can be very rapidly treated or evacuated to a local hospital. To maximize the information provided by assessment programs, it is important for these assessments to be conducted throughout the year. And with this is going to allow you to reassess the program by, one, looking at the training goals and adjusting that, looking how effective the training program is. We kind of talked about this, but it's important to have at least 2 measurements, pre and post measurements, but we can also include your mid-test measurements as well to make any necessary adjustments. Also, the timing of this assessment can be evaluating the readiness of the athlete before they actually compete. And we can use this timing of the assessment on the onset of training camp. If we're looking at novice athletes who are being evaluated prior to some sort of fitness program, we should allow them to have ample amount of time to learn the test and to learn the test safely, so we can get accurate measurements and more effective on creating our program for them. This figure here gives an example of the testing schedule for a college football player with a competitive season lasting from September to November. So the first testing session should be held before off-season workouts begin in order to guide some sort of exercise prescription, help establish training goals, and serve as a motivational tool. The second round of testing should occur at the end of the winter workouts and before summer workouts begin. So this is about 3 months before the start of the competitive season. This testing session should help strength and conditioning professionals evaluate the winter conditioning program. Also, it will allow to check the athlete's progress and continue to motivate them. The final testing session is at the very start of training camp. This serves as a final evaluation of the effectiveness of the summer training program. When it comes to actually administrating a test administrators should be well trained and should have a thorough understanding of all testing procedures and protocols. It's important that all testers have sufficient amount of practice so that they produce scores that are closely related. Other things that are important during administration of a test is recording forms. So it's good to prepare scoring forms ahead of time to increase efficiency and to reduce errors and to also make any notes. And with these recording forms, it can vary. You can have a section where it's just mainly with 1RM. You can have a section of aerobic endurance where you're including maybe the time or how the distance that they're doing. You can also list the humidity, the temperature, and also the date and time that they're performing this test. Another thing to consider when administering a test is the test format. You should consider whether you are testing these athletes if they'll be tested all at once or in subgroups or individually. But a thing to consider is that the same tester should administer a given test to all athletes if possible, and this is to help reduce the variability between testers. Another thing is that each tester should administer one test at a time. So this is very important, especially if you're doing some sort of complex test where you have to make certain judgment calls. Also consider that if you're testing individuals, individually, that it's going to take a lot more time out of the day, out of the training session or testing session, compared to if you're training everyone in one big group or smaller groups. When time is limited and the group of athletes is large, duplicate test setups can be employed to make efficient use of testing time. So just an example, if you're conducting a 300-yard shuttle, 2 test courses can be set up. Another thing to consider when administrating a test is if you are performing multiple trials of a certain test or battery test. This is an example of such as performing a 1RM. Right, but with this, there are some things to consider, is allowing at least 2 minutes of rest between attempts that are not close to the athlete's maximum. If you are close to the athlete's maximum, allow 3 minutes of rest. And if you are performing, testing batteries back to back or following one another, give at least 5 minutes so you're not having the effects of fatigue from the previous one affecting the next testing battery. Probably the most important component when administering a test is the actual sequence. The sequence of the test is designed in a way that one test does not adversely affect performance in subsequent tests. In general, the least fatiguing test should be performed first, followed by fatiguing. So you can see with non-fatiguing tests, this is usually height, weight, flexibility, skin fold measurements, circumference measurements, and vertical jump. And then this is followed by a little bit more fatiguing measurements, which require a lot more energy, such as agility tests. And then this is followed by maximum power and strength tests, and then sprint tests. Following a sprint test, such as the 40-meter sprint, you can perform a local muscular endurance test. Probably the most popular muscular endurance test is going to be the push-up test, and then it's going to be followed by the curl-up test. After your muscular endurance test, your next test would be a fatiguing anaerobic capacity test. For this example, this can be a 300-yard shuttle test. Your last test part of your testing sequence would be the aerobic capacity test, such as the Cooper 1.5 mile run or the yo-yo intermittent recovery test. Again, we want to allow time for the athlete to recover in between these tests, so just make sure that you're giving them proper rest, giving at least 3 minutes, up to 5 minutes, possibly even more. Even though there is a specific test order to follow, it is not always realistic to actually follow this order of testing. Some factors can influence the order, such as the number of athletes, the length of the testing period, and the number of strength and conditioning professionals available. When we look at the length of testing, does that time allotted for testing these athletes go up to 2 hours? Is it 1 day? Is it 2 days or more? If it is actually 2 days or more, the test that you're performing should be the most fatiguing on the last day. However, when you look at strength and conditioning professionals available, that might tie into where you are going to be performing these large groups of tests or these subgroups of tests of athletes, and this is going to eventually kind of mess up your order to actually follow. So there are some ways that we can actually prepare the athletes for the testing. One is to announce the date and time and the purpose of a test battery in advance. This is to kind of help them get in the mindset and perform well that day. You can also host a pre-test practice session Right? This is to kind of help give some familiarization of the test that you're going to be able to perform. You can also provide clear and simple instructions for them. You can demonstrate the proper test performance. You can also organize a pre-test warm-up if they don't already have one. You can also tell the athletes their scores after each trial. And lastly, you can administer a supervised cool-down period so they can have proper recovery. When looking at the different tests to assess athletes, one of the variables we can look at is maximum muscular strength. This is considered low speed strength. This is related to the force a muscle or muscle group can exert in one maximal effort, and generally we test this via one repetition maximum in a particular lift. And this lift can either be a squat, bench press, it can be a deadlift, it can even be a bicep curl if you want it to be. But generally speaking, these muscular strength tests, or these 1RMs, are performed dynamically. And what I mean by that, this is going to have an eccentric and a concentric portion. Some other tests that can be utilized looking at kind of strength is isokinetic testing and isometric testing as well. There may be at times where individuals or athletes cannot perform a 1RM, so you can also utilize a submaximal assessment. Generally speaking, this is just performing a set number of repetitions using at a certain intensity. But one thing though is that the prediction model that's utilized, or the formula, is that it's a little bit more accurate, a little bit more reliable and valid if it's under 10 repetitions. If you are performing a submaximal assessment and are performing 30 repetitions, estimating your 1RM is going to be a lot more off. All right, so the closer you are to your 1RM value, right, in nature, you're going to be a lot better on that case. Right? Not only that, testing and exercise within the training program ensures proper technique. So what I mean by this is that when this kind of ties back into what I talked about earlier in this lecture, is that when you are creating a program, right, you want to have the strength training exercises to be performed in that program and then test them at the very end. So by doing that, not only you're going to ensure that you're going to see, a good value or, an increase in performance, right? You're also going to ensure proper technique, right? So just going back to that example of squat again, right? Squat takes a lot of coordination and balance and everything compared to if you were having them do leg press and then perform squats at the very end. When it comes to 1RM testing, these are tests to measure strength for a certain area of the body. Generally speaking, to assess the upper body, the bench press exercise is commonly used. When you look at the lower body, the leg press is commonly used to assess strength. There are some other exercises such as shoulder press to assess upper body strength, and for the lower body, the squat and knee extension exercise can also assess muscular strength in the lower body. When we also look at how 1RM testing is utilized, it can be utilized for relative strength, and this is dividing it by body mass, or the individual's body mass. So as I mentioned earlier, we can look at absolute strength, and we can also look at it relatively, especially if it's important for certain sports with weight classes. So usually a big thing with 1RM testing is that there's a competition, and this is mainly dealing with powerlifters and powerlifting competitions. And with this, they have three main lifts that they perform: the bench press, the squat, and then the deadlift. So those are the three big ones to kind of look at. If you've never been to a powerlifting meet or never watched a powerlifting meet or anything like that, it's pretty intense. All right, especially for some of the build up during the squat and then during the deadlift as well. Some things to consider though is that with 1RM testing, you might have a potential risk of injury. Right? So a lot of think that people lifting heavy will injure themselves, and in some cases, that's the point in this for that. But generally speaking, the reason why they're getting injured is that they're increasing the weight too fast, or trying to maximal strength too fast at a high number, or their technique is just poor. But if you are following proper warm-up and following proper technique, right, and having spotters come in safely, then the potential risk of injury is really not the case. 1RM testing. We're going to provide some warm-up sets just so we can increase the temperature of the muscle. With this is going to be 5 to 10 repetitions at 40 to 60% of an estimated 1RM. And then after we, warm up sets with that repetition scheme, we're going to increase the weight a little bit and perform 3 to 5 reps at 60 to 80% of an estimated 1 rep. Your warm-up sets are going to vary between individuals just based on their readiness. Some individuals will warm up 2 times before they start attempting their 1RM. Some individuals might require 3 or 4 warm-up sets to feel kind of ready before attempting their 1RM. After you get done warming up, you're going to attempt your 1RM. After you attempt your 1RM, you're either going to be successful or you're going to fail. But if you are successful, say your very first attempt, then you're going to increase the weight, right? And increasing weight will depend on the upper body or lower body and also the exercise. So just in general, you're going to increase the weight about 5 to 10% for any upper body exercise. And for lower body exercise, it's going to be an increase in 10 to 20%. What we want is that we want enough rest in between these 1RM attempts, so between 2 to 4 minutes. Right? So after you get your first one, you hit the second one, or perform the second one. If you fail, you don't terminate the test, you go drop down the weight a little bit. So in between your first attempt that you were successful and then a weight that you missed, right? So say your first attempt in the 1RM, you got 150 pounds for bench press, so you increased it to 160 and you failed. So you would drop that weight down, say in between 100 to 155. And then if you're successful, you're going to increase the weight up a little bit, or if you're not successful, you're going to increase it down and you can't do until you can't get any more. Right? So hopefully that kind of clarifies the steps for 1RM testing. Another strength test that we can perform is through isokinetic testing. With isokinetic testing, this is usually looking at smaller muscle mass or isolating a certain joint to provide additional information. But with isokinetic testing, we can look at the maximal contraction at a constant velocity throughout the entire range of motion. So for example, one that's primarily utilized, or a test that's utilized, is the quadricep or the knee extension exercise. And you can see this depicted in the figure to the right. So say, for example, we can set the velocity at 120 degrees per second. So that individual can do a knee extension exercise, and they can kick this device, this kind of pad here, you can see to the right, as hard and as fast as they can, and that speed isn't going to change. But you're still going to get some sort of value, right, and some sort of velocity curve on this screen and software program. You can also perform isometric testing on this device. This device here is called the Biodex. Right? We can set different ranges of motion on isometric and see that maximal voluntary contraction as well. But the reason why we would want to utilize a Biodex or isokinetic testing is that we could be comparing muscle groups from bilateral limbs, such as the right knee extensors versus the left knee extensors. Right? So when we generally lift, we always kind of tend to favor one side or be a little bit stronger on one side. But this can be valuable information, particularly if you have athletes who are injured, or kind of giving some sort of evaluation to preventing on injury so you don't have that deficit on one side. The one limitation though on utilizing this device, this Biodex device, is that you need a lot of, some individuals or technicians with experience on using this device, and it's also time consuming as well. Another way to assess muscular strength is through isometric testing. Probably the most common exercise test that you're familiar with on utilizing is the hand grip strength test, and then also kind of like a deadlift test using a spring-loaded dynamometer using your back and legs. These tests can kind of give you some sort of value of muscular strength. Another variable that we can look at when assessing athletes is looking at the anaerobic power or maximum muscular power and anaerobic fitness. When we look at maximum muscular power, this is referred to as high-speed strength. This is related to the ability of muscle tissue to exert high force while contracting at a high speed. This can also be called maximal anaerobic muscular power or anaerobic power itself. This is usually assessed in the laboratory, and it also can be assessed within the field. But with this variable we are looking at the maximal rate of energy production by using the combination of the phosphagen system and the anaerobic glycolytic system for moderate duration activities. This is a little bit different to maximal strength, which we just talked about, just because with maximal strength or 1RM testing, that is utilizing energy for a few seconds, where here for muscular power, this is energy looking for a very few seconds. So like 1 to 2 seconds compared to 4 to 6 seconds with 1RM strength. Just because when you're performing a 1RM, you can have some sticking points where it takes a little bit longer. An example of looking at maximum muscular power in the field setting and within resistance training itself is looking at the power clean, right? And this is kind of referred to as looking at your explosive strength. There are different laboratory tests to assess anaerobic power. These differ in the mode of exercise, the sensitivity of the assessment, and the extent of information provided. Just some examples of laboratory tests that are anaerobic can be sprints that are performed on a treadmill, jumps on a force plate or contact mat, or probably the most popular one is a maximal effort cycling test, and this is often referred to as the Wingate test. And with these laboratory tests, we can assess peak power, mean power, and the fatigue rate. Generally speaking, when you are looking at your fatigue rate, or also referred to as your fatigue index, the higher the fatigue index percentage, the less likely you're able to maintain that power output for the duration of the activity. As I just mentioned in the last slide, probably the most popular, most widely used test to assess anaerobic power is the Wingate test. This test is kind of referred to as the gold standard. This is a test where an individual will maximally cycle for 30 seconds while using a resistance relative to their body weight. When we kind of look at the field test, the most popular one is going to be the vertical jump test. We can estimate the power for an individual through different formula. We can look at their peak power by their calculation of a formula that you can see here, and also their mean power through this formula here. To assess an individual's or an athlete's anaerobic capacity, you can perform a 300-yard shuttle, which is probably the most commonly used test on determining anaerobic capacity. With this test, the athlete lines up at a starting point, and then at the signal, the athlete sprints to the point 25 yards away and then returns to the starting line. This individual, the athlete, will do this for 6 times, and this time is going to be recorded. Following this, they are going to rest for 5 minutes and then perform another set of the 25 or 6 total rounds. After you get done calculating that time, what you'll do, placing them in their category, is averaging of the 2 times. And this will kind of determine the individual's anaerobic capacity, and which can be utilized for certain sports. Another test to assess an athlete's anaerobic fitness level is through the line drill. This is performed on a regulation-sized basketball court or any indoor-outdoor facility. This line drill can often be referred to as suicides if you're familiar with basketball or if you ever played basketball. But with this, the athlete begins from a standing position and sprints from the baseline to 4 separate cones. Once they reach the cone, they sprint back to the original starting point and then proceed to the next one. Right? And with this, the timer stops after they cross the finish line following the last count. During this time, and with this test, there's usually 3 trials total, with at least 2 minutes of rest in between. And all the sprint times are recorded, and the fastest time is reported. Aerobic capacity is the maximum rate at which an athlete can produce energy through oxidation of energy sources such as carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Aerobic capacity is usually expressed as a volume of oxygen consumed per kilogram of body weight per minute, or milliliters per kg. Aerobic capacity is also referred to as aerobic power. When we look at the macronutrients utilized for aerobic capacity or endurance training, this is primarily through carbohydrates and then also as fats. When we think of marathon runners who are running hours or ultra marathon athletes, there will be some times where you'll tap into the protein source for an energy source. However, you really don't want to utilize protein as an energy source if you're running long distance or if you're an ultra endurance athlete, just because utilizing protein source as an energy is very expensive for the body. Often, one of the biggest single tests that we use for aerobic capacity is VO2 max, which can be is probably one of the best indicator, or what a lot of people will think is the best indicator of fitness. There are different ways to assess an athlete's aerobic capacity. One of the ways is through direct laboratory measurement, and this is through VO2 max testing. This is going to directly measure the oxygen consumption of the athlete. When we think of VO2 max on individuals who have a higher VO2 max, that's going to be males, younger individuals, healthy individuals, and trained individuals. Basically, with VO2 max, we are performing a graded exercise test on a treadmill to exhaustion. However, you can also utilize a cycloergometer or also utilize swimming for VO2 max. But generally speaking, the treadmill produces the greatest results just because of the amount of muscle mass involved. However, one thing to note is when you are assessing an individual's VO2 max, kind of still tailor it to the specific to the athlete for the sport. So if you have an individual who is a cyclist, you're not going to test their VO2 max on a treadmill really, because that's not going to translate to their sport. You want to test them on a cycloergometer on assessing their VO2 max, just because that will give them a better indicator compared to a treadmill. Probably the most recognizable protocol when assessing an individual's VO2 max is the Bruce protocol. This is where the speed and grade of the treadmill increases in intensity every 3 minutes. So as you can see, in stage 1, the individual is walking or has a set speed of 1.7 miles per hour with a grade at 10. And after that 3 minutes, it increases to 2.5 and 12 and so on. This goes until the individual is exhausted. There's also a modified Bruce protocol, and this is mainly geared towards the elderly population, where the first 2 stages have a grade of 0 or 5%, just so you can slowly ramp them up, and the speed is at 1.7 for them, and then again it'll slowly ramp up. We're also taking heart rate every minute and RPE, or ratings of perceived exertion, at the end of each stage, just to kind of give a feel of where the athlete is at and how hard it is for them. There are other protocols on assessing VO2 max as well. However, this is probably the most widely used one. If you are in exercise testing or plan to take on exercise testing, you'll kind of go into a little bit more of the different tests involved in VO2 max assessing. To determine an individual's VO2 max, they have to hit certain criteria. One of them is a plateau in oxygen consumption. So for example, say at stage 5, your athlete or individual consumes 45 liters or milliliters per kg per minute of oxygen. At stage 6, they consume 46 milliliters per kg, and at stage 7, they hit again 46 milliliters per kg of oxygen consumption. So this would be a plateau in this criteria for the athlete or an individual. Another criteria that they have to hit is where the heart rate fails to rise with increasing workload, or their heart rate is within 10 beats per minute of the max. Generally speaking, to calculate an individual's heart rate max, it's 220 minus their age. There are some other formulas that you can utilize which are a little bit more specific, but 220 minus the age is the most commonly used. So if you had an individual who is 20 years old, their maximal heart rate would be 200. So to hit this criteria, that individual would have to have a heart rate of at least 190 beats per minute to checkmark this box. Another criteria for VO2 max is having an RP greater than 17, and this is on a Borg scale of 6 to 20. When we think of the Borg scale, this is all based off heart rate. So when this scale was kind of first created, 6 was always relating to resting heart rate of around 60 beats per minute, where the 20 was referring to maximal heart rate or 200 beats per minute. Another criteria mark is having blood lactate of greater than 8 millimoles per liter. And we take blood lactate through the fingertip, or you can also take it at the individual's ear. But what happens is that you're just pretty much sanitizing a little spot, and then you're pretty much drawing some blood pretty much through a needle itself, and then it'll go through an analyzer. Lastly, they have to have a RER, or respiratory exchange ratio, of greater than 1.15. With this, you always see this kind of in the 1.1s or higher. So it depends on the individual's criteria or what you're talking about, but this can also be as low as 1.10. There are some other criteria marks that we won't go into, but generally speaking, if you hit all of these, then that kind of indicates the individual's true VO2 max. Another way to assess an individual or an athlete's aerobic capacity is utilizing an indirect measurement, and this is primarily through submaximal exercise tests. There are different submaximal exercise tests that can be utilized, such as step tests. You can even use the treadmill, but probably the most popular mode is using a cycloergometer. Overall, though, some maximal exercise tests are based off of 4 assumptions. 1, that steady state heart rate attained and is maintained at each stage. There's a linear relationship between heart rate and VO2 max. The mechanical efficiency is constant for everyone, and lastly, heart rate max is similar for all of the same age groups. The two most popular cyclogometer submaximal exercise tests is the YMCA cycle test or the Ashton rhyming test. One of the things with the treadmill is you can have some sort of formula, such as a walking formula or a jogging formula, to calculate or estimate an individual's VO2 max. A field test, though, which can be done with large groups of individuals, is the Cooper run test. This is either the 1.5 mile run test or the 12-minute run test. How they differ is that with the 1.5 mile run, you are trying to have the individual or athlete run as fast as possible to reach that set distance. With a 12-minute run, this is where you're having the athlete or individual run as far as they can within the 12 minutes. Another assessment that we can utilize for athletes or individuals is also testing their local muscular endurance. This is the ability of certain muscles or muscle groups to perform repeated contractions against a submaximal resistance. When we're looking at some of the exercise, one test that can be utilized is the YMCA bench press test. This is where you're using a flat bench, not the incline or decline, but we have a set weight for men and women, where men lift 80 pounds and women lift 35 pounds. What you have to do during this test is follow a cadence of 30 repetitions per minute, or kind of set a metronome of 60 beats per minute. So each time you would hear a beep, you should be either at the bottom, at the chest, or at the top of the lift. The scoring is based off of how many repetitions you've completed. One thing, though, is it does not take body mass into account. Probably the more familiar local muscular endurance tests that you're familiar with are the push-up tests and the curl-up tests, and you can also perform a pull-up test to test local muscular endurance. Another important component for athletes to test is speed, because speed is very important. This is the movement distance per unit of time, which is typically quantified as the time taken to cover a fixed distance. And the most popular test for speed is the 40-yard sprint. And this is often seen during the football combine. There are other sports that have different other tests that can be utilized, such as baseball, which I believe is like the 60 feet sprint test, basically from home to first base, and there's some other ones as well. But this is relatively inexpensive, where you can use a stopwatch and a track. But you can also use electronic timers. One thing with electronic timers is that they're a little bit more precise, but they're a little bit more expensive. How they compare to an individual who's just using a stopwatch is that the tester may be 0.0 or 0.2 seconds faster than the electronic measurement time, and this is due to the reaction time delay just by pressing the start and stop button. This can be due to because you're seeing the actual athlete coming, so you're hitting that a little bit sooner compared to the electronic measurement. Another component that is often associated with speed is agility. Agility is the ability to change direction or speed of the whole body in response to a sport-specific stimulus. Agility testing is generally confined to physical capacity testing, such as change of directional speed, or cognitive components such as anticipation. And probably the two most popular tests for agility is the T-test and Pro Agility test. You can see with the T-test, the individual starts at cone A, they run 10 yards up to cone B and touch the cone, and what they'll do is they'll shuffle to cone C and touch it, and then shuffle to cone D, they'll shuffle back to cone B, and then run backwards past cone A. Where the Pro Agility test is that they start in the middle, they go to the left or go to one direction, right, and they touch the line, and then they'll sprint 10 yards to the other section on the other line, and then come back to the starting position. Flexibility is an important component in health, as this relates to functional independence and performing activities of daily living. Flexibility is the range of motion about a body joint, and we can test flexibility different ways. We can test it through the classic sit and reach test, where it is going to test your hamstrings and lower back. We can also look at the flexibility or the range of motion using a goniometer. We can often perform postural and performance screening routinely by the use of the overhead squat. The reason why we're utilizing the overhead squat is that we can look at the bilateral mobility of the hips, knees, ankles, shoulders, and the thoracic spine. The reason why we kind of want to look at flexibility and kind of the mobility of an athlete is that there are certain ranges for specific sports. And if the athlete cannot have that or obtain that certain range, this can likely lead to injury for the athlete. Balance and stability is important, as athletes with poor balance are at a greater risk of lower limb injuries. In general, athletes have also been shown to have greater balance compared to non-athletes. Balance is the ability to maintain static and dynamic equilibrium, where stability is the ability to return to a desired position following a disturbance to the system. There are different tests to assess balance and stability. One of the ways is to use unstable surfaces or using specialized equipment such as the Neurocom. Another test that you may often perform is the star excursion test, and this is testing your balance and stability on both legs. And you can see with this figure, you are looking at the left limb stance and right limb stance, and what you're doing is you're rotating and testing your balance by reaching out as far as you can, either to the lateral, your anterior, lateral, anterior portion, kind of going in a clockwise fashion. Body composition is an important component for individuals and athletes for overall health. Body composition refers to the components that make up the body. Generally speaking, we're only interested in the percentage of the body that is adipose tissue and the percentage that is fat-free. The reason why we kind of want to look at body composition is how it relates to obesity and overfatness, which is related to numerous health risks, such as cardiovascular disease, peripheral vascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, and the list kind of goes on. But the reason why we want to look at it in athletes is we want to maximize their performance by optimizing the amount of muscle and fat. One way to determine an individual's body composition is through hydrostatic weighing. This is based off of Archimedes' principle, where the body of volume equals the loss of weight in the water. During this test, an individual is submerged underneath the water for X amount of time, but before so, the individual has to breathe out as much air out of their lungs as possible. Part of the limitation with this measurement is the conversion of body density to percent body fat, as there's multiple formulas based off of ethnicity and sex. Also, the fat-free density is variable among people based off of their physical activity, their age, and their sex as well. Lastly, lung air volume can vary depending on the individual and how much they can actually breathe out. Some individuals have trouble breathing out or as much air out of their lungs as possible, where others can breathe out most of their air out of their lungs for this test. There are multiple other ways to determine an individual's body composition. Another way is by utilizing a DEXA scan, which is a computerized x-ray. Earlier though, the use of this scan is to look at bone mineral content and bone mineral density at the spine, pelvis, and femur. But now, with up-to-date software and technology, it can quantify fat and non-bone regional lean mass, plus the mineral content of deeper bony structures. Part of this is that it's precise and reliable, but it's expensive and can be technical. So we have one of these DEXA scans in the exercise physiology lab that have been utilized on looking at body composition. Nowadays, this is kind of considered the gold standard for measurement for body composition, where the old gold standard was the hydrostatic weighing. There are some advantages on using the DEXA scan, such as it can measure bone, it helps measure fat and fat-free mass, and is a passive technique. However, though, there are disadvantages as there can be different results based off the scanner utilized and the software that is utilized. The cost of the equipment is pretty expensive, and the technical support needs to be there, and as far as individuals who are conducting it, they need to be trained. Another disadvantage is that it cannot differentiate between subcutaneous and visceral adipose tissue, which can be an issue when assessing body composition. Another technique to determine body composition is utilizing the bod pod. This is where body volume is determined by air displacement rather than water, where you see this in hydrostatic weighing. Additionally, this is a little bit more comfortable method compared to hydrostatic weighing, just because you don't have to have the individuals blow out all the air out of their lungs and then hold their breath while underwater. With this requires minimal client compliance and technician skill. Really, the only thing that the client has to do is just wear compressions and a swim cap. By utilizing this is going to give a more accurate result. The reason why is because if you don't have a skin cap, this can underestimate an individual's body fat percentage. So I'm sure most of you athletes in here have utilized a body fat to determine your body composition. And this is also in the exercise physiology lab to determine body composition for research studies. So we just went over 2 laboratory measurements to determine an individual's body composition. A field test that you most likely will utilize to determine an individual's body composition is through skinfold testing. The rationale for skinfold testing is that the age-dependent proportion of the body fat is deposited subcutaneously. Also, measuring the amount of adipose tissue that can be pinched provides some indication of the amount of overall body fat. We can utilize different equations based on the number of sites performed, the specific race, the age, and the sex to determine an individual's body composition. With skinfold testing, this has a measurement error of around 3.5%. Probably the most common skinfold sites or the amount is the 7-site skinfold. However, you can go as low as 3 skinfold sites and as high as 9 skinfold sites. We just went over skinfold testing, which is a field test to determine an individual's body composition. Another field test that you might utilize is the BIA, or the bioelectrical impedance analysis. BIA is based on the principle that lean tissue conducts electrical current better than fat tissue. So, the more muscle you have, the faster the conduction, but if you have more fat, the slower the conduction. With the BIA, this sends a low-level electrical current that is passed through the body, and impedance is determined by the analyzer. With the BIA, this can also estimate the total body water that is proportional to the amount of lean tissue. There are different BIA machines, but probably the ones that you'll be mostly using is the home devices, which is the Tanita, which is analyzing foot to foot, and the Omron, which is analyzing from hand to hand. A laboratory measurement, you can utilize a BIA, which is having the individual lie down and then placing electrodes on the hand and wrist and then the foot and ankle. That's a little bit more sophisticated, but if you have the equipment available, you can utilize that BIA machine. To get an accurate estimation of body composition utilizing the BIA, individuals must follow some pre-test guidelines. One is no eating or drinking for 4 hours prior to the test. Second, there's no exercising for at least 12 hours prior to the test. Third, no alcohol consumption for at least 48 hours prior to the test. And no diuretic medication such as taking caffeine. One thing is that you can postpone testing if you are retaining water, and this is particularly for females during their menstrual cycle. Lastly, a way to determine an individual's body composition is through anthropometry. This is the science of measurement applied to the human body, which generally includes measurements of height, weight, and selected body girths. And when you think of this type of measurement, this is usually by way of BMI and circumference measurements. Body mass index is a product of weight, which is measured in kilograms, divided by height squared, which is measured in meters squared. This is universally used, and often we utilize this to look at the general population just because it has a positive relationship with percent body fat. And like I mentioned before, obesity is associated with a 3-fold greater risk of diabetes and hypertension, along with other health risks as well. Part of this BMI or this kind of assessment is that it does not separate how much weight is fat or lean body mass. So this can cause false classification. So you'll have individuals who are very muscular but kind of short in nature, and whenever you kind of calculate it based off their weight and height, they are classified as either overweight or obese. But it doesn't necessarily mean they have these high risks just because they have a low body fat percentage. But just remember, BMI can be an indicator of high body fatness. This is why it's mainly used and why it's often used. However, it's used as a screening tool and not actual measurement of actual body fatness. So after we calculate the individual's BMI, we can then classify them, where a BMI of less than 18.5 is considered underweight, 18.5 to 24.9 is a classification of normal, overweight is between 25 and 29.9, and then with obesity, there's 3 different levels where the starting point is at 30. You can also see based off this table that there's risk levels by waist circumference, which we'll talk about next. Circumference measurements are probably the most easily applied measurement to determine an individual's body composition or give some sort of estimation of an individual's body composition. Not only with circumference measurements, you can kind of see the general pattern of body fat. And this can be obviously observed in males with a belly or females where they have most of their fat accumulated around the hips. Part of the measurements is that we can also look at the waist to hip ratio. This is a simple measurement associated with increased health risks. We can measure the waist at the narrowest part of the torso, and generally speaking, this is between the belly button and the lower portion of your last rib. Another way to measure waist is right above your hip bones. We can also measure your hip, which is the maximum extension of the buttocks. Usually, this is the greatest portion of protuberance of that portion, but by taking these circumference measurements, we can look at the ratio. If we have an increase in waist to hip ratio, this increases the risk for heart attack, stroke, hypertension, diabetes, gallbladder disease, and even death. If we also look at the previous table, we can also see that a waist circumference of X amount also increases our risk for health. Here is a classification table for the waist to hip ratio. As you can see, this is split up between men and women and also provides different age ranges. If you have a male who has a waist to hip ratio of less than 0.83 between the age of 20 to 29, they would be classified as low. Similar, if you had a female who had a waist to hip ratio of less than 0.71 between the age of 20 to 29, they would also be classified as low. This is a good way to kind of categorize based off the age and sex. In summary, an assessment program can be used to examine the effectiveness of training programs, evaluate athlete potential, develop training programs, and set training goals. Also, to maximize the effectiveness of the assessment program, the test must be reliable and valid, and also must provide relevant information to both the strength and conditioning professional and the athlete. A testing battery for an athlete should be developed based on the needs assessment in order to reflect the metabolic, biomechanical, and other demands of the sport. So again, the more similar to the sport, the better the testing and the better the interpretation. And thus, you can create and tailor your training program for that improvement. Lastly, concerns for test administration include the ordering of the tests and the timing of the tests. These variables must be adjusted to allow the athletes to perform their best on the tests and to provide information at important points in the competitive cycle.